Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Now I would like to introduce Dr. Sin-Bin Kang. Sin-Bin is a principal researcher in the computer vision group in Microsoft Research. Please join me welcoming Sin-Bin.
Thanks for the introduction, Jaime. It's a great pleasure to give a speech in front of all of you. And today I'm going to be talking about how computer vision techniques can be used to benefit graphics. And I'm going to show you a few examples to illustrate that point. So as everyone knows, graphics is about generating compelling looking imagery. And it has a lot of tools in its arsenal. I mean, you can do solid modeling. You do appearance modeling by looking at illumination and surface property. And then there's a big area called non-photorealistic rendering. Hatching is one example of it. Another example is painterly rendering. And of course, we have hardware to facilitate rendering. Well, graphics can do a lot of things, but to generate really compelling looking content is more often than not laborious. And despite all the progress that's been made, photorealism is still difficult to achieve. So if you think about it, computer vision is actually kind of very complementary to graphics. Graphics is about image synthesis. It assumes that you know everything about the world and uses that knowledge to generate your output. On the other hand, computer vision is about trying to figure out what's in the world by looking through images, by analyzing the images that you've captured. So you could potentially do things like, stereo. You generate depth. You can use it for robotics applications or generate new views. You can do object recognition, and it's used for search. You can do eye tracking or face tracking and so on and so forth, and it helps with human-computer interaction. So in this talk, I'm going to illustrate my point about how computer vision techniques can help graphics. And I'm going to talk about animating paintings, looking at 3D videos where you can actually change the viewpoint while you're viewing a video. How do you generate three-dimensional models of plants and trees, and automatic image enhancement. So I'm going to start off with animating paintings. So suppose that you see a painting and you really like it and you take a snapshot of it. It's just a picture, right? And you take a picture and you want to do something interesting with it. For example, being able to animate it. So the question is, you start off with an image, it's just pixels. How do you do something like this, right? It seems rather difficult. You might say, okay, I'm just going to segment it. I'm going to use a computer vision technique and say, I'm going to segment based on intensity, right? And then you may have several versions. So I basically show you 3 versions, depending on the parameter settings that you have. But the problem with this kind of very simplistic segmentation is that it's semantically meaningless, right? You give this to an animator, and the animator would have a tough time reproducing what I've just showed you. What makes more sense, however, is to figure out how you decompose the image into hypothetical brushstrokes, right, as I've seen here. So, for example, the painting of the fish may consist of these kinds of brushstrokes. And if you present these decomposed brushstrokes to an animator, the animator would have a much easier time to figure out how to animate the painting. So what's the key to this? I think there is some theme here, which is when you have a problem but it's extremely ill-posed, you need to have prior information. And in our particular case, the prior comes in the form of shapes. So we got a Chinese painter to paint all sorts of brushstrokes that he can think of, and we digitize it. We got like 62 brushstrokes in the library, and essentially what we're trying to do is to say, okay, these are the strokes that it can assume, and this is the observation. If we decompose them, we want the brushstrokes to resemble any of the brushstrokes in the library. It cannot be outside, it cannot be arbitrary. So that makes the problem a lot easier. So here's an example. So this is a painting of a flower, and just look at this one. So the first thing we do is we over-segment. We don't care. We just over-segment, have tiny little segments, and now our job is to group them in such a way that the grouped segments resemble the brushstrokes in the library. So we have this optimization problem that we solve to generate a result that looks something like this. So anyway, here's another example. So this is the snapshot of a painting, and we ran through our algorithm. We passed it to an animator. I think the animator took like a few hours to a day, and this is the result that you see. Right, so I'm going to go on to the next topic, which is virtual viewpoint video. So I'm sure everyone has seen The Matrix back in '99, right? The problem is, in those days, you have 120 cameras, and it's a lot more difficult to generate the freeze frame. Here, what you're seeing is the user can actually interactively change the viewpoint while you're watching the video, freeze when you want to, and change the viewpoint. So it's also known as steerable video. In the MPEG community, it's also called free-viewpoint video. And the way that we generate this is we use an 8-camera system that looks like this. The separation is about 1.5 feet between cameras. We have the concentrator here that synchronizes all the cameras and pipes all the cameras directly into the hard disk. Here's an example of what it looks like. That's been captured, a very brief snippet. So it's perfectly synchronized, and you can see the viewpoint change in raster style. So what we do is we calibrate the cameras, and we apply stereo. The story is a little bit more complicated than that. But anyway, so we managed to get depths on a per frame basis. And we use the depths to reconstruct the in-between views. So I'm going to show you a short clip of what we have. So all the in-between views are synthetically generated. So we hired a group of breakdancers. They actually had won competitions in Seattle. So we have horizontal and vertical configurations. These guys are something. They're great. You can literally watch them the whole day doing this. So this has a rather cheesy storyline you'll see later. So one of the effects we're about to see is, since we managed to compute depth, we artificially defocus things that are further away. So we kind of play with different kinds of effects. Another interesting effect you're about to see is she's going to leap and then she's going to freeze while the background moves.
All camera movement within this video was virtual. 8
So you can see the
stationary
camera
calibrated
system.
cameras were used to shoot the film. For each camera, depth maps and matting information was automatically extracted. This information was used for
So if you jump from camera to camera, you get a very discrete view, but because we have computer depth, we're able to seamlessly interpolate. And we can do this in real time as well. Well, once everything is pre-processed. Anyway, so now I'm going to move on to modeling plants and trees. Now, plants and trees are extremely difficult to model because of their very complex geometry. So we resort to, of course, computer vision to extract the models for us. Before I start doing that, what we did for our work is basically say, let us sort the plants and trees based on the leaf size. This is kind of an abuse of terminology, but plants are the types of plants are those that has a relatively large sized leaf relative to the whole plant, whereas trees have very, very small leaves. So we use two different techniques depending on whether we classify as a plant or a tree. So I'm going to start off with plants first. And so what we did is we take pictures all around the plant, and we track the points, and we apply what's called structure for motion, where we extract the three-dimensional positions of the points and extract the positions of the cameras as well. So that technique is called structure for motion. Once we have that, then we use the information that we have extracted on the 3D and the texture as well. So we make use of texture information as well as the three-dimensional information to segment into the separate leaves. It's not perfect, so we do still need to interact with it a little bit, but most of it is done automatically. So once that's done, we then extract or recover the fine geometry using the 3D points that we have extracted. Unfortunately, the branches are a lot more difficult because they're highly occluded. So as a result, we have to resort to user interaction. But again, the user interaction is made more easy because of the pre-processed data that we have obtained. I'll show you a bit later. So once we have the 3D branches and the leaves, we can put them together and we generate the plant model. So as I said, so we capture a bunch of images, between 35 to 45 images, and we apply structure for motion, and we get a cloud of 3D points. In this case, it's colored here. Obviously, this is not the end result. Then, as I've said earlier, we then construct a three-dimensional graph, and we make use of the three-dimensional information as well as the texture information that you can get when you back project into the images. We use that to segment into individual leaves. Then what we do is then we pick one of the leaves as the model. It's basically a flat mesh. And for each leaf in the scene, we try to fit and add local geometry to it using a low-dimensional polynomial model. And so we do this for every single leaf that we have found. And at the end, you get what you see over here. So what about the branches? Well, this is what I mean. You make it easy for the user to generate the branches. Notice that as you draw on the 2D, it actually projects back into space close to where the 3D points are. So it's not an arbitrary back projection. So now you can actually edit in 2D in image space and in 3D. So as you scroll the view, you'll see that it has maybe moved a different way that you want it to. You can actually refine the three-dimensional location. You can also change the thickness of the branches, the location of the nodes, and so on and so forth. So even though it's interactive, it would probably take you minutes if it's a simple plant. Okay, so here are some results. Part of the fun was actually figuring out the names of plants that we are trying to model. So here we tried to do this for a tree, and you can see it's not as effective. So I'm going to describe an alternative method for modeling trees that's much more effective than this. So obviously, because you have three-dimensional models, you can actually do texture replacement if you want to. It's great what texture mapping can do. So here's a final example coming up next. And again, because you have the geometry, you can actually edit the geometry. Okay, so I talk about modeling plants. Now, what about trees? You can't use the same technique because it's extremely painful to model each leaf individually. So what we do instead is we do exactly the same as before for trees, where we capture lots of images and we apply structure from motion to extract the three-dimensional points, and as well as the camera poses. Then here, this is where there's a big change in the algorithm. We use, let's see, okay. So we model the branches, right? We model the branches because it's self-similar. What we do is we say, let's figure out what the building blocks are. A building block is basically a parent with immediate child branches. And because it's self-similar, we just randomly place them and generate occluded branches that way. As far as the leaves is concerned, we look at it from the image point of view. We look at each image, we segment into leaves, and we all back project. We don't do stereo at this point. We just back project, and where it touches the 3D branch, we let it stick. And as a result, we get something that looks like that. So this is as before. Capture between 10 and 30 images. We get a cloud of three-dimensional points. And again, this is not sufficient for rendering. We convert the segmented branch points into three-dimensional surfaces. And once we have done that, we kind of know that, which are the parent branch and which are the child branches. And we separate them to generate building blocks. So what we do next is that, given these building blocks, we randomly place them on top of the visible branch models up to a point where it touches where the leaves are. And as I've mentioned earlier, we have the input images. We know which part of the image are the leaves. We segment into leaves, and we just back project directly onto the three-dimensional branch. And where it gets very close to the branch, we let it stick. So I'll just show you results in here. So this is the recovered 3 points. And we recover the branches, and then this is where we randomly place building blocks to hallucinate the occluded branches. And this is what it looks like at the end. and of course, after you place the leaves. Here's another example. In this particular case, there's only one trunk or one branch. So we basically stole building blocks from another tree and applied to this. And this is the branch model followed by application of the leaves. So anyway, I think you get the idea. There are a few more examples. Well, capturing images and generating models using images is one way, but I would imagine it's simpler if you can sketch it, right? You sketch something in 2D and it pops it out into a 3D model. And this is what we did as well. So, but the thing is, again, it's ill-posed. So what do? We put priors in. And our prior is in the form of a database. We have a database of three-dimensional trees. We select one of the trees as the template, because within each exemplar, we have information about how the tree grows. There's a bunch of parameters that's in there, and if you select that particular exemplar, it inherits all the parameters and is used to then generate the branches. And you can grow the branches, similar to how I explained earlier, and you can just add leaves. And the leaves, again, is part of the exemplar in the database. So this is what the exemplar looks like. You have a 3D geometry. It could be scanned. It could be a model that you sort of generate on your own. And the tree parameters are essentially angles between the parent branch and the child branches. And we assume that these angles are Gaussian distributed. And in addition to that, we generate the two-dimensional silhouettes. And the reason for that, I'll show you in the next slide. And of course, we have the leaf template. Well, the 2D silhouettes is important because we use that to compare against what you've drawn. So what you've drawn is a projection of a 3D, and then we actually find a distribution of the 2D angles, and we compare against that of the silhouettes. And we pick the one with the closest set of parameters. And then we kind of inherit those parameters to build our three-dimensional model. So we rely on self-similarity, and that's the reason why it works pretty well. We also, the user can choose to draw a crown to constrain where it can grow. So here's an example of branch propagation. So once you have drawn it, it will pop it onto 3D, and then using the idea of self-similarity, you'll randomly place branches there. And after that, you'll just put in the leaves. So here's an example. What happens if you have a crown, if you don't have a crown? If you don't have a crown, it will grow like 5 generations and stop. Whereas if you have the crown, it will grow up to the limits of the crown and stop. You can see that the appearance is different. You can actually generate a plausible looking tree just with a few strokes, as you can see here. Now, if you add in a few more strokes and just draw a crown, all of a sudden you have a very different looking tree. Here's another example. You can draw as many strokes as you want. And what is interesting is it tries to generate a pretty plausible looking tree. What is interesting is that if you use the same sketch, but you apply a different exemplar, you get pretty different results. So you could imagine that just by changing a few strokes, adding a crown, choosing a different exemplar, you get very different set of three-dimensional trees. So this is a pretty flexible tool. I think when we did this a few years ago, we had only about maybe 12, a dozen different exemplars, but we were able to generate a lot of different looking trees. So finally, I'm going to talk about image enhancement. I'm sure a lot of us have taken photos that could have looked a lot better, like it need color correction, it need contrast enhancement. And there are tools out there that would allow you to automatically enhance it. Picasa has it. It's called the I'm Feeling Lucky button. And Windows Live Photo Gallery also has it. The problem is that you give it the same image, it will give you the same output, no matter who did it, right? And I think intuitively, different people have different preferences on how to enhance images. For example, certain people might prefer images to be a little bit more saturated or have more contrast than others. And this is not reflected in tools like Picasa and Windows Live Photo Gallery because it applies some generic algorithm that analyzes the image and always predictably gives you the same output. So what we did is we basically say, okay, let's try to capture these preferences. Suppose we have a small set of images in the database, and we present the images one by one to the subject, and the subject basically, kind of click along and basically figure out like which are the how the subject would basically enhance the images, and we will save the enhanced parameters for each image, and given an input image, it would try to figure out what is the closest image in the training database, use the enhancement parameters associated with that closest image, and then enhances it. Right. So, well, does this work? We did some user study. We used 25 training images. This was the training images were automatically. I don't have time to go through this, but they were automatically selected from 5,000 random images that we got off the web. They were chosen in such a way that it sort of spans maximize the span of image enhancement space. So we have a training interface where the middle one is originally the image, and we have different enhanced versions. So if the subject picks, one of the periphery images, it will go to the center, and then it will enhance that version. So it keeps enhancing up to a point where the best version is the middle one, and it stops. And so at the point, then you kind of know, the enhancement parameters that would map the original image to the one that the subject likes the best. Okay. So these are some of the results. So this is one example of one input image. This input image is not part of the database. So Picasa gives you this result, photo gallery, and you can sort of see that different subjects give you different outputs, which is interesting. When we first started up with this project, we didn't know what to expect. We know intuitively that different people have different preferences, but we don't really know how significant these differences are. So like I said, we did a user study. We actually started with 15 subjects. It turns out that one of the subjects can't see color, so we had to exclude him. We should have asked him from the very beginning. But anyway, so we have 14 subjects. We get them to train using the training 25 images that you've seen earlier. And then we did a pairwise comparison. So we have the input, the subjects. We apply the enhancement on all these unseen images using the database that we have collected. The median subject, so you have the subject and everyone else. So we kind of pick the median of everyone else. So that's the median subject. And then we compare against the Windows Live Photo Gallery and Picasso. So we randomize the order of pairings. So the user would have to choose the left or right or no preference. So these are the results. This is kind of interesting. If we compare the subject's own result versus the input, the mean is significantly more. This is the 1 sigma bar. So this is significant. The difference is significant. Subjects versus the median subject, again, it is significant. But what is interesting is that even though the mean is better than Picasso's, it's not statistically significant, which means that Picasso actually had done a very good job in optimizing the enhancement settings. But you could imagine, like, putting our system on top of Picasso's, where it spits out an output, and then we personalize that output. However, if you take the metric where you say, do you prefer all the images predominantly in one area or another area? Suppose that you're comparing a subject's own versus the input. Because we have 20 images, if you prefer 11 or more of the subject's own, we'll add +1 to this. Otherwise, we'll +1 to the input. And by this metric, we are basically kind of doing well against all the rest. So this is just figuring out if enhancement parameters make a difference, and indeed it does. So the next question is, are there clusters of enhancement? Right now, we only dealt with 14 people. If we dealt with hundreds of people, is there a cluster amongst them? Why is this important? Well, if we discover that there is a small cluster, then training is so much simpler, right? Let's say we have 3 clusters. Then all we need to do is just maybe give you 1 or 2 images for you to enhance, and then we'll figure out which cluster you belong to, and that's it. Alternatively, we can have a tool interface that gives you a small number of buttons. Each button corresponds to a cluster, and that's it. So what we did is, again, we did another user study, this time using Mechanical Turk. And this is the web interface that the subject sees. It basically just clicks until the middle one is the enhanced version that the subject likes. And then we built databases. We have more than about 330-something people, and we have 330-something databases. So then we analyzed them, and lo and behold, we actually got a very small number of clusters, which was really surprising to us. We also had a questionnaire that we asked them to fill, like the gender, the age, and the experience with cameras, and so on and so forth. But we couldn't tell if there is a preference one way or the other. I mean, they're all very similar in terms of gender and age distribution. They're all very similar. So we couldn't say anything about that. So I've just talked about 4 different things. Animating, Chinese paintings, and the computer vision technique that we use was segmentation. For free viewpoint video, we use the computer vision techniques of multi-view stereo. And for plant and tree modeling, we use structure for motion and multi-view stereo. And for the image enhancement, we use auto-image correction techniques. And of course, we also use machine learning, which everybody's using these days. And of course, all these was made possible with help with other people, and these are the cast of characters that helped make all these happen. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sim-Bing. We have time for a couple of questions. Any questions for Sim-Bing? No questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Sim-Bing.